Millionaire yells at a boy selling candy on the street. Where did you get that pendant? It's not yours. What if the answer you've been searching for is closer than you think? A devastating loss, a life filled with shadows, and an unexpected encounter that could change everything. Amidst the chaos of the city, a man and a boy cross paths in a way no one could predict. Painful memories and new mysteries intertwine in a journey filled with deep emotions, where the past insists on returning and the future seems uncertain. Destiny offers a new opportunity, but the truth might be more surprising than anyone could imagine. The sun shone brightly through the large windows of Robert's office, bathing the room in a soft, golden light. The elegant furniture and sophisticated decor reflected the taste and success of the man who worked there. The walls were adorned with framed photos that told the story of a happy family. Radiant smiles, birthday parties, sunny seaside vacations. Each image was a fragment of a life that now seemed so distant, almost unreachable. But there was one photo that always drew Robert's attention the most. In it, his brother Miguel was holding little Caio in his arms. Both were beaming, as if the whole world were a perfect and safe place. Robert approached the desk, his fingers gently stroking the frame of the photo, as if he could bring back those moments just by touching the image. A wave of nostalgia mixed with a deep pain flooded his heart, causing him to close his eyes for a moment, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. Time had passed, the years had been cruel, but the pain of loss remained embedded in his soul like a wound that never fully healed. He allowed himself a moment of weakness, something he rarely did. With his eyes still closed, Robert let the memories of that fateful day take over his mind. The tragedy that had ripped his brother, sister-in-law, and the little twins from his life had been so abrupt and devastating that, sometimes, he still wondered how he managed to go on. The news of the accident had come like a mortal blow, a stab in the heart that never stopped hurting. Robert remembered the cheerful conversations he had with Miguel, the unmistakable smell of the chocolate cake that Mariana used to bake for the children, the laughter that echoed through the house and filled the space with life. Now, all that was left was the deafening silence and immeasurable emptiness. "What did I do to deserve this?" he murmured to himself, his voice low and trembling, as he sat heavily in his leather chair. The burden of maintaining the business empire he and Miguel had built together seemed unbearable in the face of the personal pain he carried. The numbers and graphs that filled the computer screen in front of him seemed to lose all meaning. Nothing he did seemed to matter, except for the longing he felt for his brother and his family. What he wanted most at that moment was to be able to go back in time, to share one last cup of coffee with Miguel, to hear his jokes, and to feel the warmth of the friendship and brotherly love that had always united them. The day dragged on slowly, as if time were stuck in some sort of limbo. Outside, the city pulsed with life. People came and went, rushing, immersed in their own routines. But for Robert, all of that seemed so distant, so out of reach. He was trapped in his bubble of sadness, unable to connect with the world around him. He grabbed a glass of water and walked over to the window, watching the constant movement of people and cars passing by in a hurry. He wished with all his might that life could be as simple and carefree as it once was when there were no shadows looming over his existence. Hours passed, but the suffocating feeling didn't subside. Robert decided he needed to leave that oppressive space. He put on a light coat, grabbed his car keys, and left the office. The idea of driving aimlessly, getting lost in the city streets, seemed appealing, as a way to escape his torturous thoughts, at least for a while. As he got into the vehicle, he felt slightly lighter, as if the breeze could carry him away from his pain. The car's engine purred softly, and as he drove, the city streets began to unfold before him, one after another, as if guiding him somewhere. Without knowing exactly why, Robert decided to go to the park, a place he used to frequent with Caio and the twins on sunny days. It was a refuge of peace amidst the chaos of the city, a place where children could run freely, and where he allowed himself, for a brief moment, to forget all his worries. Upon arriving, he parked the car and got out, feeling the fresh and invigorating air hit his face. The laughter of children playing in the playground greeted him like a melodic symphony, and for a moment, he allowed himself to smile. He watched the little ones running, climbing up and down the slide, playing ball, and remembered how life was full of small joys, simple moments that now seemed so precious and distant. He sat on a nearby bench, and the sight of those children playing brought back a flood of memories. He closed his eyes and let himself be carried away, imagining Kaio running toward him, with that mischievous sparkle in his eyes and his high-pitched voice calling him uncle. The weight of longing enveloped him once again, and a solitary tear rolled down his face. "Where are you, my little one?" he whispered, not expecting an answer, knowing that his words would be lost in the wind. After a few minutes of contemplation, Robert realized that the sky was beginning to darken. He stood up, deciding it was time to go back. The city's traffic seemed like an endless maze, and Robert found himself stuck in a sea of vehicles moving slowly. With the gleaming hood of his luxury car and the air conditioning blowing a soft breeze, he tried to find some peace amid the chaos. The sound of engines and honking echoed around him, but his mind was far from there, immersed in memories that blended with his pain. He watched the city through the glass, people moving hurriedly, each with their own stories, and wondered if anyone there knew what it was like to lose everything. As he waited, his eyes fixed on a group of children playing in a nearby park. They ran, laughed, and had fun, without any worries about the adult world. A smile involuntarily formed on his lips, but it was soon replaced by a shadow of sadness. He remembered Kaio, his beloved nephew, and how those simple moments of joy had become a painful memory. The image of the boy running after a dog, with his messy hair and that contagious smile, made his heart ache. "Why aren't you here, my boy?" Robert murmured to himself, his voice almost lost amid the noise of the city. He admired the bustling life around him and felt, paradoxically, more isolated than ever. The traffic jam seemed endless, and his patience began to wear thin. Time seemed to drag on, and he longed to escape that prison of iron and glass. However, when the light finally turned green and the cars began to move, a small figure appeared in his line of sight. A boy, no older than 10, with a sharp look on his face, approached, selling candy. He carried a small box full of treats, and his gaze was intense, almost penetrating. Robert hesitated at first, thinking of refusing the purchase, but the boy's expression was captivating. Something in that look made him feel less alone, as if that encounter was a small ray of light in his dark life. The boy stopped beside the car, holding the box of sweets tightly. "Sir, would you like to buy some candy? We've got gum, chocolates, all very tasty." His voice was cheerful, but there was a touch of vulnerability that Robert couldn't ignore. He shook his head, ready to refuse, but before he could speak, something caught his attention. A pendant gleamed on the boy's neck, and his heart raced as he recognized the object. "Wait a moment," Robert said, his voice now firmer. He leaned forward, studying the pendant more closely. It was identical to the one that had belonged to his brother, something he had seen countless times. The feeling of déjà vu washed over him like a wave, and he wondered how that boy could have something so precious. "Where did you get that pendant?" Robert asked, his curiosity now piqued. The boy looked at the pendant, then back at Robert, a slight nervousness taking over his face. I found it," he replied, hesitantly. "It was in a strange place, near a river. I was playing and saw something shiny in the water." He seemed more intrigued by Robert's reaction than by the story itself. "Do you know this pendant?" "It belonged to someone I loved," Robert replied, the emotion almost choking him. "Can you tell me more about where you found it?" He was aware that the question was loaded with hope, but the urgency in his voice was undeniable. Isaac, as he later learned the boy's name, hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I was with a friend. He showed me the place. It was near where people go fishing. It was there, between the rocks," Isaac explained, looking at the pendant with admiration. Robert's heart raced even more. What does this mean? Could it be a sign that Kaio is still nearby? He thought. He felt a wave of determination flood his being. If that pendant was indeed a link to his past, he needed to find out the truth. "Isaac, can you promise me something?" Robert said, trying to stay calm while fighting against the growing urgency. "What, sir?" the boy asked, curious. "Promise me you'll help me find out more about this pendant." I need to know. Isaac hesitated for a moment, but the sincerity in Robert's eyes made him nod. I promise. I promise to help, the boy exclaimed, now filled with enthusiasm. Robert felt a mix of relief and anxiety. He knew that this encounter was not a mere coincidence. There was something about that boy and the pendant that connected him to Kaio. He couldn't simply ignore this connection, but at the same time, he feared what he might discover. What if his hopes were crushed again? What if he was deluding himself, seeing what he wanted to see? These questions swirled in his mind, but he pushed them away. He needed to stay focused. He needed to believe that, perhaps, this time, things could be different. Where do you live, Isaac? Robert asked, trying to find out more about the boy. I live at the São Jose shelter, over there, Isaac said, vaguely pointing north. I was taken there a few years ago. I don't remember much from before that. Robert's heart nearly stopped. A shelter. That explained a lot, but it also raised more questions. He needed to find out more about Isaac's past, about how he ended up there, and whether there was any connection to Kaio's disappearance. Can I give you a ride there? Robert offered, trying to sound casual. Isaac hesitated, looking at the street as if considering the offer. I don't want to bother you, sir. I'm used to walking, he replied politely. It's no bother at all. I would insist, Robert pressed, feeling the urgency to keep the boy close. After a moment of hesitation, Isaac finally nodded. He opened the car door and got in, sitting in the seat next to Robert. The millionaire felt a mix of relief and tension as he drove toward the shelter. Every minute with Isaac only intensified his need to know the truth. On the way, Robert tried to make small talk, asking trivial questions about life at the shelter, but Isaac gave short answers, still wary. He was a resilient boy, clearly used to taking care of himself, but there was something in his eyes that revealed a certain vulnerability. Robert could see that life hadn't been easy for him. Finally, they arrived at the São Jose shelter, an old building worn by time. Robert parked the car and watched as Isaac got out, politely thanking him for the ride. The boy entered the building, and Robert remained seated for a moment, watching the shelter's entrance, his heart still racing. He knew he needed to investigate further, but he also knew he couldn't rush. With a sigh, he got out of the car and headed toward the shelter's entrance. Upon entering, he was greeted by the director, an elderly and kind woman named Sister Teresa. Robert introduced himself and explained that he was interested in making a donation to the shelter, an excuse he knew would work well. While they talked, he discreetly mentioned Isaac. Isaac? Sister Teresa repeated, surprised. He's a good boy, very quiet. He arrived here a few years ago, but we don't know much about his past. He was found on the streets, without any documents, and no one ever came looking for him. The answer made Robert's heart ache. Isaac's story seemed to fit, but there were still too many unknowns. He knew he needed more information, and that meant gaining Isaac's trust and the trust of those responsible for the shelter. He seems like a very special boy. I'd like to get to know him better, Robert said, trying to keep the conversation casual, but feeling the tension grow inside him. I'm sure he would be happy to have someone to talk to, Sister Teresa replied with a gentle smile. Isaac doesn't have many friends, but he's a sweet and very polite child. As Robert left the shelter, he felt that he was about to embark on a journey that could change his life forever. The hope was lit, but there was also the fear that it might all be an illusion. Still, he was determined to move forward, to discover the truth, no matter what it meant. The days that followed were marked by a whirlwind of emotions for Robert. The image of Isaac wearing the pendant that had belonged to his late brother Miguel wouldn't leave his mind. Every detail of that encounter replayed in his head. Like a movie, he couldn't pause. He wondered if fate had truly placed that boy in his path for some greater reason. Robert tried to focus on his work, but the idea that he might finally be closer to finding Kaio distracted him constantly. In every meeting, in every document he signed, his mind wandered back to that shelter, to the story Isaac had told about finding the pendant. He knew he needed to investigate further, but he also knew he couldn't just show up at the shelter and demand answers. He needed a plan, something that would allow him to get to know Isaac better and, perhaps, discover more about his past. One afternoon, after an especially long and tedious meeting, Robert picked up the phone and called the São Jose shelter. After a few rings, the kind voice of Sister Teresa answered. "Hello, Sao Jose Shelter. How can I help you?" she said, in her usual gentle tone. "Sister Teresa, this is Robert. I visited the shelter a few days ago and mentioned that I'd like to help. I've been thinking a lot about it and would like to visit the shelter again. Maybe spend some time with the children, if that's possible," Robert said, trying to sound casual, though his heart was racing. "Oh, of course, Mr. Robert. It would be wonderful to have you here again. The children love visitors, and I'm sure Isaac would be happy to see you," Sister Teresa replied, with enthusiasm. Robert felt an unexpected relief upon hearing Isaac's name. He knew he needed to establish a stronger connection with the boy to understand what was really going on. After scheduling the visit for the next day, he spent the rest of the day planning his approach. He needed to gain Isaac's trust, but he also didn't want to scare him. The boy was clearly reserved and wary, traits Robert understood perfectly. The next morning, Robert woke up early, feeling a mix of anxiety and hope. He grabbed some toys and books, memories from when Kaya was little, and put them in the car, thinking they might be a good way to approach the children. When he arrived at the shelter, he was greeted by Sister Teresa, who led him to a room where several children were engaged in different activities. Isaac was there, sitting in a corner, focused on a drawing he was making with colored pencils. When he saw Robert, he lifted his eyes and smiled shyly, but didn't approach. Robert realized he would have to take the initiative, so he slowly walked over, trying not to interrupt what the boy was doing. "Hi, Isaac. How are you today?" Robert asked, crouching beside the boy. "I'm fine, Mr. Robert. I'm just drawing a little," Isaac replied, without taking his eyes off the paper. "Can I see what you're drawing?" Robert asked, curious. Isaac hesitated for a moment, but then turned the paper so Robert could see. It was a drawing of a house, simple but full of details that showed Isaac had talent. There were trees around, a flowery garden, and a blue sky, almost as if the boy were trying to draw a place where he felt safe. "That's a beautiful drawing, Isaac. You're very talented," Robert complimented, sincerely impressed. Isaac shrugged, hunching a little, as if he weren't used to receiving compliments. "I like to draw. It's one of the few things I can do when I'm not selling candy," he explained, simply. That answer touched Robert deeply. The boy was in a tough situation, but he still found ways to express his creativity and take refuge in something that gave him pleasure. Robert knew he needed to find a way to help him, not just because of the pendant, but because he felt an increasing responsibility toward him. "You know, Isaac, I brought some toys and books that my nephew used to love when he was little. I thought you and the other kids might like them," Robert said, trying to find a way to connect more with the boy. Isaac's eyes lit up for a moment, but he quickly returned to his more reserved expression. "Thank you, Mr. Robert. I'm sure the other kids will like them," Isaac said, with a small smile. Robert felt he was making some progress, but he knew he needed to go slowly. He spent the rest of the morning at the shelter, talking to the children, playing with them, and watching Isaac closely. The boy seemed to be opening up, albeit slowly, and Robert felt there was more there, something that needed to be discovered. At the end of the day, when the children were heading back to their rooms, Robert asked to speak with Isaac in private. Sister Teresa, always attentive, arranged a quiet place for them to talk. Robert knew this might be his chance to find out more. "Isaac, can I ask you something?" Robert began, trying to keep his tone light. "Sure, Mr. Robert," the boy replied, curious. "About the pendant. You said you found it near a river. Have you been there more than once?" Robert asked, trying not to sound too insistent. Isaac looked at the ground, as if trying to remember. "Yeah, I've been there a few times. It's a quiet place where I like to go when I want to be alone. Sometimes I went with my friend, but he moved away a while ago, and now I go alone," Isaac replied, still in a low voice. Robert was intrigued by the mention of the friend who had moved away. Who could he be? Could he have some connection to Kaio? And this friend, do you know where he went? Were you very close? Robert asked, trying to hide the urgency in his voice. He was nice, but he didn't talk much. "I don't know where he went. One day he just didn't show up anymore. The people at the shelter said he was adopted," Isaac explained, shrugging. Robert's heart raced. The word adopted brought back all his hopes and fears. What if Kaio had been adopted by another family? What if he were living a new life, without remembering who he really was? Robert felt he needed to investigate further, but he knew he couldn't push Isaac at that moment. I understand, Isaac. It must have been hard to lose a friend like that. But if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here, okay? Robert said, trying to convey security to the boy. Isaac nodded, but didn't say anything more. It seemed he had reached his limit for that conversation. Robert decided not to press him any further, thanked him for his time, and said goodbye, promising to return soon. As he drove home, Robert couldn't stop thinking about the possibility that Isaac knew more than he was saying, but that he wasn't yet ready to share. He would need to be patient, to gain the boy's trust, and gradually piece together this puzzle. Robert knew that the journey ahead would be long and difficult, but he was willing to face it. The seed of hope had been planted, and he was determined to make it bloom, no matter how long it took. The weeks that followed were a test of patience for Robert. He continued to visit the shelter regularly, trying to get closer to Isaac and the other children. Gradually, he won the boy's trust, who began to see him not just as a stranger, but as someone he could rely on. Robert knew that, to uncover the truth about the pendant and Isaac's past, he would need to build a strong relationship with him. On one of the visits, Robert decided to take Isaac on an outing outside the shelter. He asked for Sister Teresa's permission, and she, trusting Robert's good character, agreed, provided that he assured her the boy would return safely. Isaac seemed excited, but also a bit nervous about the idea of going to a different place. Robert chose a quiet park, far from the hustle and bustle of the city, where they could talk without distractions. As they walked, he tried to keep the conversation light, talking about trivial things like the weather, the games Isaac liked to play, and the places he wanted to visit. Isaac responded enthusiastically, but Robert noticed that the boy was still cautious, as if he were protecting something. Isaac, have you ever thought about what you'd like to be when you grow up? Robert asked, trying to approach the subject indirectly. Isaac stopped for a moment, looking at the horizon, as if pondering the question. I don't know. I guess I don't think about it much. I just want to help my mom and live in a place where I feel safe, he replied, with a sincerity that touched Robert deeply. Robert felt a lump in his throat. Isaac's answer was simple, but carried a wisdom he hadn't expected from someone so young. He realized that the boy wasn't interested in grand ambitions. All he wanted was a home, something Robert knew how hard it was to find when you were alone in the world. I understand, Isaac, and if I can help, know that I'm here for that. Not just for you, but for anyone who needs it, Robert said, in a sincere tone. Isaac looked at Robert with a curious expression, as if trying to understand why someone like him would care so much. Thank you, Mr. Robert. I know you're trying to help me, and I appreciate that, Isaac said, with a small smile. Robert knew there was still a long way to go, but he felt he was getting closer to the boy. Deep down, he knew the key to understanding Isaac's past lay in his relationship with the friend he had mentioned, the boy who had been adopted. It was possible that this friend knew more about the pendant and about Kaio, but Robert still had no idea how to find him. When they returned to the shelter, Robert thanked Sister Teresa for her trust and said goodbye to Isaac, promising to come back soon. On the drive home, he decided he needed help. He couldn't do this investigation on his own. He thought about hiring a private detective, someone with experience in finding missing people and solving mysteries like this one. The next day, Robert contacted an old school friend who now worked as a private detective. He knew the man was discreet and competent, someone he could trust to handle such a delicate matter. Robert, it's been a long time, greeted the detective when Robert entered his office. What can I do for you? Robert told him the whole story, from meeting Isaac to his suspicions that the pendant might be connected to Kaio. The detective listened carefully, taking notes and occasionally asking questions to clarify certain points. This is intriguing, Robert. If this boy really found the pendant and has a connection to your nephew, we need to figure out how it all ties together. I'll start by investigating the shelter and seeing if I can find any leads about the friend Isaac mentioned. I'll also look into recent adoptions, especially in the area where he said he found the pendant, the detective said, with a professional air. Robert thanked him, feeling relieved to finally have someone more experienced helping with the search. In the following days, he continued to visit Isaac at the shelter, maintaining the routine of outings and conversations. He was determined not to push the boy, but also knew that every moment spent with him was an opportunity to learn more. One afternoon, as they walked through the same park as always, Isaac abruptly stopped and stared at the horizon, as if he had remembered something. "What is it, Isaac?" Robert asked, noticing the sudden change in the boy's behavior. Isaac frowned, as if trying to put into words what was on his mind. I remember something about the pendant. I'm not sure, but it's like I've seen it before I found it in that place," Isaac said, hesitantly. Robert's heart raced. This was the first time Isaac had mentioned something like this, and he knew he had to be careful with how he handled the situation. "Where do you remember it from, Isaac?" Robert asked, trying to keep his voice calm, even though he was fighting against the anxiety. Isaac shook his head, confused. "I don't know. It's like an old memory, but I can't understand it properly. I think I dreamed about it, or maybe someone showed it to me when I was little," Isaac replied, visibly frustrated by his inability to recall clearly. Robert felt they were on the verge of something important, but he also knew that pressing Isaac could make him withdraw again. He needed to give the boy space for the memories to surface naturally. "It's okay, Isaac. You don't need to force yourself to remember now. These things sometimes come up when we least expect them. But if you remember anything else, I'm here to listen, okay?" Robert said, with an encouraging smile. Isaac nodded, looking a little more relieved. "Thank you, Mr. Robert. I'll try to remember more. I promise," the boy said, with a determination that touched Robert. As they returned to the shelter, Robert couldn't stop thinking about the possibility that Isaac was beginning to remember something important, something that could finally shed light on the mystery of the pendant and Kaio. He knew he needed to be patient, but the anxiety was starting to take over. Every day, the hope of finding Kaio seemed closer, but at the same time, the fear that it was all an illusion also grew. That evening, as Robert sat at home, the phone rang. It was the detective. "Robert, I think I found something. It's not a definitive answer, but it could be a lead. There's a record of an adoption that coincides with the period you mentioned. I'll need more time to investigate, but I'm optimistic. We might be on the right track." Robert felt a wave of relief and hope. They were finally making progress. He knew the road ahead was still long, but for the first time in years, he felt there was a light at the end of the tunnel. The detective's news gave Robert new energy. In the days that followed, he dedicated himself even more to his visits to the shelter, trying to maintain the balance between his desire to discover the truth and the need not to pressure Isaac. He continued taking the boy on outings to the park, encouraging him to talk about his memories and dreams, always gently, without forcing anything. Isaac seemed more at ease with Robert each day. The boy was beginning to talk more about himself, about the shelter, and about the few friends he had there. He mentioned the friend who had been adopted several times, but never gave details that might help identify him. Even so, Robert felt they were getting closer to something important. The boy was starting to trust him, and that trust might be the key to unlocking the memories he held. One afternoon, as they walked through the park, Isaac looked at Robert with a serious expression, something he rarely did. "Mr. Robert, can I ask you something?" Isaac said, his voice full of uncertainty. "Of course, Isaac. Ask me anything," Robert replied, trying to sound as calm as possible, though he felt his heart speed up. Isaac hesitated for a moment, as if trying to find the right words. Do you think I'm Kaio?" he finally asked, his eyes searching Robert's. The question caught Robert by surprise. He had tried to keep his suspicions to himself, without sharing too much with Isaac, but it seemed the boy had sensed something. Robert knew he had to be honest, but also careful with his words. "Isaac, I'm going to be honest with you. Since I saw the pendant, I've had this hope, this idea, but I'm not sure of anything. What matters is what you feel, what you remember. If you were Kaio, that would change a lot of things, but at the same time, you would still be the Isaac I've come to know," Robert responded, his voice firm but gentle. Isaac looked at the ground, thinking about Robert's response. "I don't know if I'm Kaio. Sometimes I have strange dreams, like I'm someone else, but at the same time, it's me. It's confusing. I don't want to disappoint you, Mr. Robert. I like you," Isaac said, with a sad tone. Robert felt a pang of pain in his heart. The boy was struggling with something much bigger than he should be carrying. Robert knelt beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Isaac, you could never disappoint me. Whatever happens, I'm here for you, okay? You don't need to be Kaio to be important to me. I already care about you. A lot," Robert said, with a sincerity that made Isaac's eyes glisten. Isaac nodded, still seeming a little unsure, but relieved by Robert's words. They continued walking, without saying much more about the subject, but the bond between them seemed stronger with each step they took together. That night, as Robert was at home, the phone rang. It was the detective again, and his voice sounded more urgent than before. "Robert, I need to see you. There's something you need to see. It's about the adoption record I found," he said, without giving many details. Robert felt a chill run down his spine. He knew the detective wouldn't ask for a personal meeting unless it was something really important. They arranged to meet at a cafe in the city center the next day. When Robert arrived at the cafe, the detective was already there, with a folder of documents in hand. His expression was serious, almost grim, which increased Robert's anxiety. "What did you find?" Robert asked, without hesitation. The detective opened the folder and pulled out a document, placing it on the table. "This is the adoption record I mentioned. The adopted child is the same age Kaio would be today, and the physical descriptions match. But there's something more. The couple who adopted the boy is from a neighboring town, and they have connections to the orphanage where Isaac was. This doesn't prove anything on its own, but it's a coincidence that's hard to ignore," the detective explained, handing the document to Robert. Robert looked at the paper, his heart pounding. The dates matched, the physical descriptions too. But there was still doubt, that persistent shadow that haunted Robert. "And Isaac? What does this mean for him?" Robert asked, his voice trembling. "That's what we need to find out. If Isaac really is Kaio, this could change everything. But we also need to be prepared for the possibility that he isn't. After all, he was the only one not found after the accident, right? What do you want to do now?" the detective asked, watching Robert closely. Robert knew he was at a point of no return. He had to decide what was more important, continuing the search for the truth or protecting the bond he had created with Isaac, regardless of his true identity. "We need to confirm this, but at the same time, I can't leave Isaac in the dark. He deserves to know what's going on," Robert said, with renewed determination. In the days that followed, Robert tried to process all the information the detective had found. He knew he needed to have an honest conversation with Isaac, but he also feared what that might mean for the boy. Robert decided the best way to approach the matter was slowly, revealing only what was necessary, without overwhelming Isaac with too much information at once. One afternoon, he took Isaac to the park, as usual. They sat on a bench in the shade of a tree, watching the other children play in the distance. "Isaac, I want to tell you something," Robert began, trying to keep his voice calm. Isaac looked at him, with a curious expression. "The detective I hired found some information about an adoption that happened a few years ago. It might be about Kaio. But before we move forward, I need to know how you feel about this," Robert said, choosing his words carefully. Isaac stayed silent for a long time, seeming to ponder Robert's words. I want to know the truth, even if it's hard. If I am Kaio, I want to remember. If I'm not, at least we'll have tried," Isaac said, with a maturity that surprised Robert. Robert nodded, feeling a mix of pride and concern. He knew they were about to cross a line from which there was no turning back, but he also knew it was necessary. The next morning, Robert and Isaac went together to the clinic where the DNA test would be performed. The environment was cold and clinical, and the tension between them was palpable. Robert held Isaac's hand as they waited, trying to offer as much comfort as possible. The process was quick, but for Robert, each second felt like an eternity. When it was all over, they went home, and the wait for the results began. The following days were long and quiet. Robert tried to keep to his routine, but the anxiety was always present, like a shadow he couldn't shake. Finally, the day of the revelation arrived. Robert received a call from the clinic, informing him that the results were ready. He and Isaac went together to pick up the envelope, and the tension in the car was almost unbearable. When they arrived at the clinic, the envelope was handed to Robert, who held it as if it were a treasure or a curse. Back in the car, they sat in silence, both unable to open the envelope. "Do you want me to open it?" Robert asked, finally, his voice trembling. Isaac looked at him, his face a mixture of fear and determination. "I think yes. I don't know if I can," he replied, his voice shaky. Robert took a deep breath and, with trembling hands, opened the envelope. He looked at the paper inside and read the words that would change their lives forever. He stayed silent for a long time, trying to process what he was seeing. "What does it say?" Isaac asked, his voice full of fear. Robert looked at the boy, his eyes filled with tears. "It says that you are Kaio. You're my nephew," he finally replied, his voice choked. Isaac stayed silent for a moment, processing the words. Then, a wave of emotion hit him, and he started crying, hugging Robert tightly. I'm Kaio. I'm Kaio," he repeated, sobbing in Robert's arms. Robert held him tightly, feeling a mix of joy and sadness. Finally, after so many years, he had found his nephew. But at the same time, he knew Isaac, or rather Kaio's journey, was just beginning. They returned home, where they would spend the next few days trying to process the truth, trying to understand what it meant for the future. But one thing was certain. No matter what happened, they would face it together. The days that followed were filled with expectation and anxiety for Robert. With Isaac's permission, the detective delved deeper into the investigation, searching for all the possible connections between the pendant, the adoption, and the boy's past. With each new discovery, Robert felt they were closer to finding the truth, but he also knew that what would be revealed could change everything. One morning, Robert received a call from the detective, asking him to come to the office immediately. The urgent tone in the detective's voice made Robert's heart race. When he arrived, he was met with a grave expression on the detective's face. "Robert, I found something you need to see," said the detective, handing him a thick envelope. "This is the full report of the investigation. There are many coincidences linking Isaac to Kaio, but the only way to be sure is through a DNA test." Robert opened the envelope with trembling hands. The photos and documents inside were a mix of hope and fear. The dates matched, the physical descriptions as well. But there was still doubt, that lingering shadow that haunted Robert. I don't know if I can do this. What if I find out he isn't Kaio? It will destroy everything," Robert said, his voice breaking. The detective placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "I know it's difficult, but you need to know the truth. And regardless of the result, you've already connected with Isaac. That doesn't have to change," he said, firmly. Robert knew the detective was right, but the fear of losing Isaac, even if he wasn't Kaio, was overwhelming. He needed time to think. He thanked the detective and left the office, driving aimlessly through the city streets. As he drove, Robert found himself thinking about all the conversations he had with Isaac, all the moments when he felt a real connection with the boy. If he were Kaio, it would mean he had found his nephew, but if he wasn't, it would mean he had found someone equally important. Robert knew that, regardless of the truth, his life was irrevocably tied to Isaac's. At the end of the day, Robert returned home, still undecided about what to do. He sat on the couch, holding the pendant that Isaac had been wearing when he first met him. He knew that small object had changed his life, but he also knew the future was uncertain. The next day, Robert decided it was time to talk to Isaac. He needed to be honest, to share his fears and hopes, and to let the boy have a say in the decision as well. He took Isaac to a quiet cafe, where they could talk privately. "Isaac, I have something important to discuss with you," Robert began, trying to stay calm. Isaac looked at him, his eyes filled with curiosity and slight apprehension. "What is it, Mr. Robert?" the boy asked, his voice calm but attentive. Robert took a deep breath before continuing. "The detective found many coincidences between you and Kaio. The dates, the physical descriptions, everything seems to match. But the only way we can be absolutely sure is through a DNA test," Robert explained, feeling the weight of his words. Isaac stayed silent, processing the information. Robert could see the internal struggle on the boy's face, the fear and hope colliding in his eyes. "A DNA test," Isaac repeated, thoughtfully. "And if I'm not Kaio?" Robert felt a sharp pain in his chest. He knew that was the question both of them had been trying to avoid. "If you're not Kaio, that doesn't change how I feel about you, Isaac," You're important to me, no matter what. But we need to know the truth, for you and for me, Robert said, his voice filled with emotion. Isaac nodded, though he seemed visibly shaken. I understand. I think we need to do this. I need to know who I am, where I come from, Isaac said, with a surprising maturity for his age. Robert felt a mix of pride and sadness. He knew they were about to embark on a journey that could change everything, for better or for worse. The next morning, Robert and Isaac went to the clinic together for the DNA test. The atmosphere was cold and clinical, and the tension between them was palpable. Robert held Isaac's hand as they waited, trying to offer as much comfort as possible. The process was quick, but for Robert, every second felt like an eternity. When it was over, they returned home, and the waiting for the results began. The next few days were long and quiet. Robert tried to keep his routine, but the anxiety was always present, like a shadow he couldn't shake. Finally, the day of the revelation arrived. Robert received a call from the clinic, informing him that the results were ready. He and Isaac went together to pick up the envelope, and the tension in the car was almost unbearable. When they arrived at the clinic, the envelope was handed to Robert, who held it as if it were a treasure or a curse. Back in the car, they sat in silence, both unable to open the envelope. "Do you want me to open it?" Robert asked, finally, his voice trembling. Isaac looked at him, his face a mixture of fear and determination. "I think yes. I don't know if I can," he replied, his voice shaky. Robert took a deep breath and, with trembling hands, opened the envelope. He looked at the paper inside and read the words that would change their lives forever. He stayed silent for a long time, trying to process what he was seeing. "What does it say?" Isaac asked, his voice full of fear. Robert looked at the boy, his eyes filled with tears. "It says that you are Kaio. You're my nephew," he finally replied, his voice choked. Isaac stayed silent for a moment, processing the words. Then, a wave of emotion hit him, and he started crying, hugging Robert tightly. I'm Kaio. I'm Kaio," he repeated, sobbing in Robert's arms. Robert held him tightly, feeling a mix of joy and sadness. Finally, after so many years, he had found his nephew. But at the same time, he knew Isaac, or rather Kaio's journey, was just beginning. They returned home, where they would spend the next few days trying to process the truth, trying to understand what it meant for the future. But one thing was certain. No matter what happened, they would face it together.